Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, that was really nice. I'm Maggie Evans from the Office of the President, and I'd like to welcome you all to this semester's final lecture in the Madison Vision series. I'd also like to give a special welcome to our Passport students and add a quick reminder that stamps will be ready in the lobby after the completion of the question and answer portion of our program today. The purpose of this series is to elevate the discourse at JMU by bringing prominent thinkers and leaders to campus who can help us look at our current civic landscape from different perspectives and to think about what it means to create an engaged and enlightened citizenry as we work to become the model of the engaged university. Through the Madison Vision Fund, we are proud to sponsor the Madison Vision series and want to thank our series co-sponsor, the Office of Madison Institutes in Outreach and Engagement, as well as supporters of the fund who have made this series possible. I would now like to welcome to the stage JMU President Jonathan Alger to introduce our Madison Vision series speaker. President Alger?
Thank you, Maggie, and good afternoon, everybody. I especially would like to recognize Maggie Evans and Bill Wilson, who between the two of them do a tremendous amount of work behind the scenes to make the Vision series come together. Can we give them a hand? Thank you both. And my great thanks to all of you for being here. I know we're getting close to a well-deserved break. Is anybody looking forward to that? I thought so. So I hope that you all have a wonderful opportunity to spend time with family and friends in this coming week, but I'm especially glad that you're here with us today. So I know there are a lot of topics thinking towards next week that you can't necessarily talk about at your typical Thanksgiving Day gatherings, right? With like politics, religion, may not be the best topics with certain family members or friends, but perhaps today's talk will provide you with some fodder for discussion around the table next week. After all, who could resist a good discussion of liberal arts education and citizenship with their turkey and stuffing or whatever your food of choice is next week? So if you pay close attention this afternoon, you could really impress your family and friends next week. This Madison Vision series, as you all know, has become a way for us to spark conversations within the community about how we can be engaged with and in the world in meaningful ways. Our speakers have enlightened us and challenged us to think beyond ourselves, to think beyond the immediate needs of our day-to-day lives, and to imagine a better future that we can help shape. That brings us to today's speaker, Dr. Danielle Allen. Dr. Allen has degrees from Harvard and Cambridge and has taught on the campuses of the University of Chicago, Princeton, and Harvard. She has received a MacArthur Fellowship. Do you all know that program, the Genius Grants? So we have a true genius in our midst today, and has served on the Pulitzer Prize Board. So given all these incredible, impressive credentials, you might expect that Dr. Allen would be content spending all of her time and energy in a relatively isolated ivory tower thinking great thoughts. But Dr. Allen is very much a public intellectual in the best sense of that term, a rare individual who can share brilliant insights with a wide audience and who can help us all to see how complex concepts can have practical and profound applications and implications for our lives in today's society. Her 2014 book, Our Declaration, anybody had a chance to read it? I'd highly recommend it. Our Declaration walks us through the Declaration of Independence phrase by phrase and is a beautiful example of this gift. Currently serving as the director of Harvard's Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics and as a professor in Harvard's Government Department and Graduate School of Education, Dr. Allen is also chair of the Mellon Foundation Board and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Yet another project of hers, however, is perhaps one that speaks to our mission and vision most of all, and this is something that really struck me in reading about her background. Dr. Allen founded the University of Chicago's Civic Knowledge Project to develop and strengthen community connections in that city. This project provides educational and humanities programming that helps to overcome social, economic, and racial divisions among various communities on the south side of Chicago. That is true, engaged citizenship that makes a real difference in people's lives. Friends, it's my honor and pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Danielle Allen, who will deliver her talk, Participatory Readiness on the Liberal Arts and the Ethics of Citizenship. Dr. Allen, the floor is yours. Welcome to JMU.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. It's a beautiful campus and a beautiful place. I haven't been in the Shenandoah Valley before, so it's a pleasure to be here. Though I'm somewhat daunted by the incredibly generous introduction the president gave me. For me, it's always the question and answer portion that is the best part, the most fun, the reason I like to talk with audiences. And it's always in the hopes of being elevated by all of you that I'm here. So it's a pleasure to be talking with you today. Thank you, President Alger, for the invitation, Maggie as well, and Bill, for your gracious hospitality today. It's really, you've gone above and beyond, and I appreciate it. I'm planning today to engage with you in the conversation I understand you to be having on campus about what it means to be an engaged university and precisely what civic and community engagement consist of. And I take us in our broad national culture to be somewhat confused about those concepts at the moment. So I'm hoping to spend some time with you. I'll talk for about 45 minutes in a reflective consideration of precisely what we mean by civic engagement or community engagement or whichever term we choose to use. And I've started out my lecture with a term that's been introduced to the conversation recently, the phrase participatory readiness. Now, where does this phrase come from and what does it mean in the first instance? In 2013, there was a commission on the humanities and social sciences that was launched and run by the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. This commission had been charged by Congress to study the question of how the humanities and social sciences are doing in the country at present and how we should be thinking about their role in society. And the commission put out a report called The Heart of the Matter, which did a really important thing within the context of educational policy in this country from the last few decades. If you've been paying attention to educational policy, you'll know that since the early 1980s and a report called Nation at Risk, through to another report in the early 2000s called Rising Above the Gathering Storm, the focus in our educational policy language has been on achieving college and career readiness for students in order to ensure that this country can compete in a global economy. And the focus of that emphasis on college and career readiness has been largely oriented towards the STEM fields, science, technology, and engineering, and math. The answer then is that those fields are what will give us a workforce that can compete globally in the context of rapid technological innovation and so forth. But if you think about that phrase, college and career readiness, long enough, you start to notice that there's something that's really missing there, right? And that's about that part. What does it mean to become prepared to be a citizen, to be a responsible civic participant or civic agent in our contemporary world? And so this commission, in its Heart of the Matter report, made an argument that we should think about participatory readiness as one of the key things that we have the job of preparing young people for, to be ready to participate in their communities, to be ready to participate civically. So I wanted to start by sharing some language from that report. And as I share it, what I'm also going to do then is point to a couple of details in the language that highlight some of the places where I think we have confusions about how to think about what civic engagement is in the first place. And I should say, for full disclosure, I served as a member of this commission. So I contributed to this language and therefore share some responsibility for its confusions, its points of confusion, but also want to take the opportunity to build on it and take us further. So let's see, there we go. Goal number 1 out of 3 that this report proposed: educate Americans in the knowledge, skills, and understanding they will need to thrive in a 21st century democracy. The Commission therefore recommends a new dedication to participatory readiness as an educational goal. We urge a nationwide commitment to preparing K-12 students for full participation in a democratic society. The Commission commends the Common Core State Standards Initiative for its inclusion of history and civics in the basic literacy curriculum. It promotes the competencies necessary for full civic participation in American society: voting, serving on juries, interpreting current events, developing respect for and understanding of differences, along with an ability to articulate one's sense of the common good. So there are two things to call our attention to here. One simply is the use of the word civic and the absence in this language of the word political, right? So we talk about voting, and we're talking actually about political participation, and yet the language we use for it at the moment is the adjective civic. Why is that exactly? What's happened to the political? That's one of the questions I think we have to ask. The second issue that comes up in this report is a question around what exactly counts as the kind of participation we're interested in. We have the conventional examples of voting and serving on juries, and those are clearly important, fundamental duties, responsibilities, but there must be more to participation than that. We can't organize our shared lives, take full responsibility for our communities merely by voting, serving on juries. So what else is there? And the report goes a little bit beyond those conventional, traditional, institutional aspects to focus on respect for others and the ability to articulate one's idea of the common good. But those are half steps toward a fuller picture of what civic engagement or even political engagement might consist of. So to dwell for one more moment on this issue of our vocabulary, I want to just draw your attention to an unusual panel I watched on video a couple of years ago. This was from a conference at MIT that was about participatory culture, a phrase that means the use by young people of social media in particular to participate in cultural life, share images, develop narratives, circulate them online, engage each other in communities of fandom and so forth. So think of the Harry Potter Alliance being an example of the kind of community that has emerged in the social media landscape based on young people's cultural affinities. And on this panel, this was a group of young people who are all using digital technology for various kinds of activist projects. So on the far left, on your side, there's a young man who was part of a group that was working on trying to secure more safe space, more safe space in the American public sphere for American Muslims. Sitting next to him is a young woman named Dorian Electra, who had been working really hard through YouTube and other sorts of channels to disseminate Hayekian economic ideas and advocate for free market economic policies. And then sitting next to her, a representative of the Harry Potter Alliance, which at this point in time was working on marriage equality issues. All of these issues, as you can see just from my description of them, are ones that have been at the front and center of national political attention. And these young people on the panel were asked whether they considered themselves political. And you can see where this is going. Each of them said no. They didn't consider themselves political. So working on the issues of marriage equality, economic policy, the place of Muslims, American Muslims in the public sphere, no. They said, no, I'm not political. These are not political issues. So you have to say that this is a somewhat strange situation, especially given that the words civic and political actually mean the same thing in terms of their basic etymology. They both go back to antiquity, to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where we had the first examples of polities built on the basis of popular sovereignty, a democracy in ancient Athens, a republic in ancient Rome. Political just comes from the Greek word polis for city. And similarly, civic comes from the Latin word cives for a citizen of a town or a city. So at their root, both the words civic and political simply mean being part of a community and taking responsibility for it. So there's a bit of a mystery then exactly. What has happened to the political? And where has it gone? And then the second question alongside of that, when we use the categories of civic agency, civic engagement, or even political agency and political engagement, do we just mean voting, or do we mean something else beyond that? So these are the questions, I think, that we are all wrestling with as we try to understand public participation now in the 21st century in America. So to address these questions, I want to turn to historical conceptions of civic agency, because I often think that we can get a better handle on our current situation if we take time to step back and compare ourselves to earlier moments. There's a scholar at Columbia named Michael Schudson, a sociologist, who's provided a terrific account of different moments in American history and the different kinds of civic agency that each moment generated. And one of the values of his accounts is not only that he identifies types of civic engagement or types of citizenship, but he also explains the developmental needs of each of those types of citizenship. And so what does that phrase mean? What does developmental needs mean in this context? To function as a civic agent requires certain kinds of intellectual labor, certain kind of psychological labor, and so forth. So one needs preparation for both those aspects, the intellectual and the psychological. And so his point is that for every model of civic agency that we've had throughout our history, there's been a distinctive kind of education that's gone with it to support it. So what is the picture that he paints of our history here? He starts at the founding period by identifying a model of the trusted man of good character as the leading image of the citizen. So we have here a picture of the Committee of Five submitting the Declaration of Independence to Continental Congress. And the idea is that in this period of time, citizenship consisted of voting for the most respected members of the community with regard to issues of character. And so that the education that was relevant for participating in this place, whether as one of the elite leaders or as one of the ordinary people voting among elite leaders, was an education that focused on questions of character and was largely religious in its substance. So this is a model, of course, that, as we know, is also connected to the role of white male property holders as the, in effect, sort of patriarchal heads of households with responsibility for their communities generally. But the point is that this is the first model of civic agency that we had, one that depended on character and reputation and was connected to a religious education. But then, of course, politics changed dramatically in the wake of people like Andrew Jackson and so forth, and the rise of big party populist politics, the expansion of the suffrage and so forth. And so by the end of the 19th century, we have party-based, very strong, populist party-based approaches to politics and models of civic agency that go with this. And so now we move from the trusted person of sterling character as the model of the civic agent to the loyal partisan as the model of the civic agent. The goal of this kind of civic agency is now a matter of sticking with your party, voting the whole party ballot at the election point, participating in big public parades which the parties held to drum up support, and then receiving the benefits of party patronage and cronyism and so forth that came from partisan solidarity. And here, the educational demands were quite different. You didn't even have to read in order to participate in an election. You could just take a whole ballot that belonged to the party and go ahead and deposit it. So literacy was not a big part of this picture of civic agency, and instead, the emphasis was on questions of loyalty and solidarity and partisan commitment. Judson argues that in the early 20th century, that model got replaced by the model of the informed voter. During the era of progressive politics, women get the vote, and this is a picture of suffragettes who are at a League of Women Voters citizen school, where the point of these citizen schools was precisely to provide voters with information and prepare them to take responsibility for their choices, not rely on party leaders to tell them what to think. And this model of citizenship came to prominence at the same time that the profession of journalism was professionalizing and establishing standards for itself, moving away from yellow journalism of slander and ad hominem attack and scurrilous, unchecked sources to standards where you left scandals out of the paper, sources had to be verified and validated and so forth. So there was a big emphasis on information provision in the kind of education a citizen needed in this progressive era. And then the fourth model that Judson identifies us as having developed comes from the civil rights era, and he calls this model the rights-conscious citizen. And so now what we have is a civic agent who not only needs to be well informed about issues of the day, but also has to understand the structure of rights in the Constitution and in our legal system, and be in a position to advocate for cases where injustices in respect to those rights need to be rectified. So again, it's a very different kind of preparation to think about understanding a structure of a rights regime, being able to say, here is a place where the rights regime is not being met, we're not meeting the standards of it, we're not living up to it. Here are the changes that we need in order to achieve that. And as you might imagine from this picture of the young men at the lunch counter as well, there's a very different kind of psychological preparation that goes into taking a public stance like that in an effort to fight injustice. It's a very different sort of psychological model than we get from the informed voter model. So this has been our history. Where are we now? What is the conception of civic agency that currently frames our thinking about our own politics and our own potential as members of a democratic polity? To answer this question, I'd like to reframe the ethics of civic agency by putting it in a bigger philosophical context, taking us back, in some sense, to the roots of the question of what politics is about in the first place. And to do this, I build on the work of a philosopher named Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt was a mid-20th century philosopher, was a German Jewish emigre, came to this country as a result of the destruction of Nazism in World War II. And she published a really important book called The Human Condition. And in The Human Condition, Arendt makes an incredibly important intervention in the history of philosophy. So going all the way back to Plato, a picture of politics had been developed in which some people were supposed to be leaders, other people were supposed to be followers. If you think back to your reading of Plato's Republic, you might remember that in the Republic there's a philosopher king who has the job of guiding the entire citizenry, and then there's a group of warriors, there's a group of craftspeople, and there's a group of farmers. And Plato's view of justice, his definition of justice, was that each person should do the job for which they're suited. One job per person, and that's it. Right? We have this division of labor. And that basic picture of politics, where you've got elite leaders and followers and laborers separately, that stayed with us for a long time. And Hannah Arendt's major contribution was to say, no, it's not the case that there's one job for each person, that we have categories of people. Instead, every human being has needs in all of these spaces. Every human being needs to labor, in some sense, to provide for themselves their biological needs to support themselves. And for her, that what she called the realm of labor was about food and nourishment, but it was also actually about reproduction and family life and so forth. And then she said, secondly, actually, and everybody has a need to be a craftsman of a sort. And she called this the domain of work. And what she meant by being a craftsman was that we all have a need to participate in a culture of meaning making, whether that's through our religion or through our ethnic community or through our extended kinship network. Together we make things in our world, we make symbols, we tell stories that give meaning to our communities. And these traditions to which we contribute are an important part of our own sense of personal identity and growth. And we all need to be makers in this space. And then she said the third thing that we all need is to be political beings, to live in the world of action, and to contribute to what she called world making. And what she meant by world making was that as a polity settles on its constitution and its laws, it's establishing the rules of the game that really shape the possibilities for all of us. So together with our laws and institutions, we make the world of our possibilities, the ways we can move through space with one another, collaborate on projects with one another, build lives out. So we all need this political action as well, and the activity of world making. So this world making piece that she focused on, she then described as having as its central component a practice of judgment. Okay? So what does it mean to actually make a world? It's to be a judge who diagnoses the circumstances around herself or himself and has a prescription for the course forward that we should all undertake together. And beyond diagnosing and prescribing, then there's a third job of justifying the course, because the point of making our worlds together is that we have to justify our choices to one another. We have to convince each other that this is the course that collectively we should be pursuing. So it's not enough just to diagnose circumstances and to say, hey, I think we should go this way. One also has to make the case for it, to justify it. Now, I want to make this idea of world-making concrete for you by giving you a very specific example from our own history of what I take to be a sort of exemplary case of world-making. And it comes, of course, from the Declaration of Independence, my favorite text. And it is a beautiful example of what Arendt meant by world-making. So let me just remind you of the basic shape of the Declaration of Independence. It starts, of course, with the phrase, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary. What does that phrase do? It's introducing a diagnosis. We're going to get a story about the course of human events and their meaning, and a case for the action that is required, the prescription, as a result of the meaning of the course of human events. Okay? So in its very beginning, the Declaration announces to us that it is diagnosing contemporary circumstances. The colonies are suffering a tyranny in the argument of the document, and it's proposing a prescription. They're going to declare independence, and they're providing a justification, a combination of principles, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and facts, that facts be declared to a candid world. Okay? This combination of principles and facts is the stuff of the justification. And by doing this work of diagnosis, prescription, and justification, it's not merely the case that the colonists sort of let Britain know what they think of them, they actually make their world together. They establish the terms of their mutual engagement with one another in the colonies as they prepare now to write the Articles of Confederation and establish laws for themselves. They define who they are as a people in the very first sentence of the Declaration, and in so doing, establish new standards for one another for understanding what their actions mean. And I could say more about precisely how the Declaration of Independence helped make the world for the people of 1776. We might want to come back to that in the question time, but I'm just going to leave that there for the moment so you have a concrete example of what I mean by world making and how diagnosis, prescription, and justification come together in the work of politics. Okay, so here I would say is the core intellectual work of world making that I take to be at the heart of civic engagement and community engagement and political engagement, whichever term you take to be at the fore of your consideration. But so now that we've identified the intellectual work involved in civic engagement, what practical tasks in the world follow from that? Okay, can we build out our picture of civic agency by figuring out what practical tasks come along with that intellectual work? And here I want to point to 3 tasks that are typically introduced in the literature of political philosophy to say, what is civic agency about? And those 3 tasks are deliberation, to start. We'll come back to the example in a second. Prophecy and advocacy, okay? And so what are these exactly? This photograph is a picture of a New England town hall meeting. And so this is our standard model of, our image in the head that we have of deliberation. People getting together in the ideal dispassionately deliberating on public questions and applying universal principles to those public questions in order to achieve as close to consensus as possible to support the outcomes, all right? So conversational collective decision-making based on certain standards of argumentation. That's what we take to be one key piece of action, type of action for a civic agent. Prophecy is a completely different matter, of course, right? You don't have to be disinterested or dispassionate to be a prophet. Quite the contrary, in fact. You should be passionate and committed. But what does a prophet do precisely? A prophet, rather than deliberating, claims to have identified errors, moral errors, in the values that a society is using to understand itself, and wants to introduce new values, to replace old values with new values. And Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech is a perfect example of a prophet at work, showing people where they've fallen short of their ideals and asking them to change their values to embrace, in his instance, the cause of racial equality. Okay? Advocacy, then, is a third thing altogether. So not simply in the world of rhetoric, in the world of persuasive speech and eloquent speech, but actually connecting to political institutions and pursuing a specific question. So this is a newspaper article from reporting on the work of Susan B. Anthony as she pursued the right to vote for women. And again, this is another case of an interested, passionate person pursuing one particular line, trying to get a specific policy change through. So we have 3 types of action: deliberation, prophecy, advocacy. Each of them is an element of civic agency. And it's certainly the case that we've seen times where those 3 elements come together. So take as an example another suffragette, Elizabeth Stanton Cady, who wrote the Declaration of Sentiments for the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The convention met, and they deliberated on whether to adopt the Declaration. And so in that mode, participating that way, Stanton Cady was a deliberator. Stanton Cady, sorry. But she was, of course, the person who had drafted the text in the first place, and so in that mode, she had functioned as a prophet, trying to install a new set of values. The Declaration of Sentiments takes the Declaration of Independence and replaces the word men, for example, with men and women, and does other things to be very explicit about the inclusion of women in the political body. But in addition to her work on the text as a deliberator with her fellows at Seneca Falls, she was a very active advocate. So she traveled around the Northeast, for example, pursuing legal changes to get rights for women to have bank accounts. And there's a sort of list of very specific policies that she actively pursued. So we've got these 3 types of action, and they connect to 3 different sort of figures of a civic agent. And so one question that I think is a tricky one for me is whether it's possible in our present world to say that there's a single type of civic agent, or whether perhaps what we have is a world in which we have multiple figures of the civic agent bumping up against each other. And we're often, I think, not sure which model we should hold up as the paradigm of civic agency. So if we take those intellectual tasks and those types of action, it yields three different types of civic agent. In the first instance, again, the League of Women Voters being a paradigm example of what we now would call the civically engaged individual. And the League of Women Voters carries on the tradition of the informed voter from the era of progressive politics in the early 20th century. It does focus on provision of information, focuses on working in a bipartisan way, emphasizes disinterestedness, and emphasizes participation in traditional institutions. But then you also have the activist, and here's a photo from Occupy Wall Street. And they take a very different approach to the question of civic engagement, passionate, not disinterested at all, in their instance not focusing particularly on policy frameworks or proposals, but focusing on advocacy around values, specific values. And then you have the figure of the politician, okay? So I'm gonna come back to each of these three types of civic agent to figure out, well, what's the developmental burden that goes along with each of these types of civic agency, and how should we think of these different categories of civic agent in relationship to one another? But I always, when I come to politicians, also like to pause just to remind us what we currently think about politicians. So this is a graph from Gallup about Congress's approval ratings, okay, which hit an all-time low in 2014 at 9%. It's come up a little bit, but still it's historically low. And I like to remind people of this fact just because at the end of the day, it can't possibly be sustainable for a democracy to have its legislative branch, its most important institution, have this degree of legitimacy in the eyes of the public. It just can't be sustainable. So we have a deep political problem here, and somehow it does connect to the figure of the politician, and perhaps to why the word political doesn't seem usable to us any longer. So I just want to point my finger in the direction of a problem there, or an issue to think about. But let's come back to the core topics again. I've identified these three tasks of civic agency: deliberation, prophecy, and fair fighting. And I suggested that they're connected to the three common types of civic agent: the civically engaged individual, the activist, and the politician. But now again, what about the developmental burdens of each of these roles? If we were thinking about educating people to be any one of these things, what should that education be like, or what does it require? So let's start with the civically engaged individual. I've been describing this person as dispassionate, disinterested, a deliberator, who focuses on sort of nonpartisan frameworks and therefore also on universal values. So the question of how exactly a person achieves this. You have to be, if you're going to take the role of being a civically engaged individual in this fashion, you have to learn how to counteract self-interest, to be legitimate in your claim to be acting in a disinterested fashion. And that means you have to figure out how to test the universality of your views. If those views are really universal, then you'll have tested them to see how they are received and understood from people in very different subject positions from yourself, all right? This particular type of civic agent also has a huge responsibility to consume high-quality information on a wide array of issues, all right? Because this civically engaged individual who takes a disinterested stance, and the dispassionate stance, the bipartisan or universal stance, has to be ready to deal with any and every possible public issue. And that's a very high burden then for information consumption and information sorting and filtering, all right? So I think these are the key developmental burdens for the civically engaged individual. But what about the activist, right? Okay, this is a very different kind of role. Now, an activist has something that they want to get done, and therefore that person needs to start with clarity about interests and goals. But in my view, that clarity has to be connected to an ideal of equitable efficacy, okay? So again, this person is not disinterested, they're passionate and committed, they want to do something, they're pursuing their own interests, and they need clarity about them. But I would argue that they need to be equitable in their understanding of that, what they're pursuing. And what does that equitability mean precisely? I think it means a couple of things. It means that they have to be good at thinking about the relationship between means and ends, and recognize that the quality of their ends has to be reflected in their means. Okay? In other words, this is to challenge the idea that an activist should define him or herself with the view that, by any means necessary, right? That the project, any means can be used to pursue the ends of activism. To the contrary, I'm arguing that an activist, well understood, well defined, would be equitable in their work and therefore pursue just ends and use just means in order to achieve those just ends. But in addition, the activist is a person who draws a lot on the prophetic realm and therefore has to be good at that shifting of values that I described. Now, people in the literature of psychology and marketing and places like that also call this the work of frame shifting, when you can shift people from one set of values to another. So they have to be good at understanding their strategic goals. They have to be good at the tactics that go with those goals. They need to be good at frame shifting. And they have to have ethical parameters for ends, means, reasoning. I want to say one more thing there about this idea and about this idea of equitable efficacy. And this is a little subtle and hard. We'll come back to it in questions. I hope you'll ask me questions about it. But the novelist Ralph Ellison said about democracy that his definition of democracy was that it was a winner-take-nothing form of politics. Winner-take-nothing. Now, what does that mean exactly? This is a way of defining fair fighting, or fighting fair. And this is really what an activist needs to do, is to fight fair. So a winner-take-nothing democracy means that you're expecting, even in victory, that you'll leave your opponent without dominating your opponent. Your opponent will be able to continue to thrive. So there's a limit, in some sense, in democracy to the degree to which we want victory in any particular issue. Okay? And this is, again, it's a hard one to think about. What does it mean to have a winner-take-nothing politics instead of winner-take-all politics? But that's the shift, I think, that's necessary if one wants to be an activist and recognizes that pursuing equitable efficacy is the thing that makes activism compatible with the ongoing work of democracy. So, to the politician, what precisely are the developmental burdens of civic agency for a politician? Well, I think in some instances, the politician has to take precisely that role of disinterested deliberator, and therefore needs to learn how to counteract self-interest, needs to learn how to test universality, and needs to consume a wide array of high-quality information. But sometimes a politician has to, in fact, be an activist, advocate for things. And in that instance, the politician needs to have clarity about interests and goals, be good at the levers of change in institutions. How do you drive institutions? They have to be good at this prophetic work with values, this work of frame shifting I've been talking about. Have to be good at means and reasoning, and I would say to be ready for winner-take-nothing politics. So I actually had started using Boehner as my example here well before he decided to step down from his office. So it's coincidental, in fact, that this fall we've seen Boehner, in fact, move precisely back and forth between these two roles. The partisan loyalist on the one hand, advocating and fighting for specific things, and the more disinterested deliberator working on behalf of the public good. So, and of course, the politician needs a distinctive kind of expertise in the functioning of political institutions. Okay, so what about the ideal citizen? What does that person need? And you'll probably be able to guess where I'm going. In my view, the ideal citizen, like the ideal politician, needs all of those things. So there should be no difference, really, between what the politician needs and what the ideal citizen needs. But who's an example of an ideal citizen? I have no idea. So if you have any suggestions, I would be delighted for your nominations for a picture that could go here, right in this spot, okay? But this is a big ask, in other words, the idea that preparing people to be ready to participate in civic life and community life actually requires all of these things. And so I want to just review again what I think are the core ethical challenges of civic agency, which I've sort of glanced over in describing each of these types of agent. But, core ethical challenges of civic agency. The first one is, how do you deal with self-interest? Again, are you trying to counteract it? Or are you admitting to your own interested commitment to something and seeking to be equitable in your pursuit of your specific interests? And that's connected to the question of how we treat others, okay? If I'm pursuing my own specific interests, how am I thinking of the interests of others? Am I trying to dominate them completely, or am I ready to participate in winner-take-nothing politics? And a concrete example of this might be if you think about the marriage equality issue, right? We now are contesting the question of religious accommodation around the marriage equality issue. And I would say that's exactly right. I mean, that's where you get to the winner-take-nothing point, that there will need to be accommodations around religion precisely in order that people not be dominated in the process of our working through these complicated questions. Okay, but that was a very specific example of what it means to talk about winner-take-nothing politics in contrast to winner-take-all politics. Means-ends relationships. Again, this, as I said, in the world of activism in particular, we've gotten used since the 60s to thinking that a reasonable framework for that is a sort of by any means necessary framework. And I'm challenging that with a view instead that if you are pursuing a framework of activism for how you think about civic agency, then you really have the job of figuring out how to make sure that the standards, the ideals that define your ends are also incorporated in your means. Okay. So, that's a big ask, all of this, right? Figuring out how on earth do you prepare people for all of this? How do you educate people for all of this? Big ask. And so one question is that three distinct types of preparation? Okay? Or is it possible to reintegrate the conception of civic agency and have all of it in one place? Again, you can probably tell where I'm going. I would argue for a reintegrated conception of civic agency that prepares people to shift according to the occasion from the role of the deliberator to the role of the advocate or the prophet, to the role of the politician who's actually participating in public service and so forth. To be able to move through those different roles and understand which thing is relevant at which point in time. So in my argument, the ideal citizen is ready for the intellectual work, the ethical challenges, and the work in the world of civic agency, and knows when to deploy each type of civic role. Okay? So how exactly do we prepare for work as challenging as that? Well, we know what our civic ed has traditionally looked like. So here's a worksheet from Nevada, right, which is teaching students about how bills pass through the Nevada State Assembly, and that will remind lots of you of the old, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill television jingles. This is important. We need this kind of civic education, but we have to recognize it as merely tactical. It's just about the institutional levers. Whereas the project of being a civic agent, of being engaged in a community or in one's country, requires a much bigger, richer kind of preparation. So what more is there? I'd like to point to a couple of intriguing data points and then make a general suggestion at the conclusion of my lecture here. So these intriguing data points came out, again, in the work of this commission on the heart of the matter. So, and some of these data points will be familiar to you. The first and most commonly known one is that college education seems to have a big effect on people when it comes to participation. And so when you look at the data, just even on voting, you'll find that rates of voting track levels of education. And one's level of education is a better predictor of one's likelihood of voting than even one's income. Okay? There's a stronger correlation between levels of education and participation than between income and participation. So college is doing something that is, in fact, already getting our young people to be civically engaged. But what exactly is college doing? Okay, because not all college is the same, and this is where things start to get particularly interesting. That if you start to break down the data according to how people are majoring, you'll find that people who are majoring in the humanities are participating more than people who major in STEM courses. Okay? This is just two classes, so these are just data points. It's not a comprehensive study. But these are statistically significant numbers. So for the class of 2009, humanities majors were more likely to have voted by 1 year out than STEM majors. And as far as writing to public officials is concerned, there the difference is quite substantial between humanities majors and STEM majors, right? But it's not just at college and in college majors where we see these differences. If you look at K through 12 too, and the results of K through 12 education, SAT scores also reveal something pretty significant. So this is from the work of a political scientist at Duke named Sunshine Hilligus, who tracked the relationship between high scores on the SAT on the verbal side and high scores on the math side and likelihood of participating via voting. And it's pretty straightforward. The higher your verbal SAT score, the more likely you are to participate. The higher your math score, the less likely you are to participate. Okay? Now, of course, these are complicated data analyses, and some people score high on both, so this is controlled for all of that. So the point is, in general, how do the patterns show themselves? But higher verbal scores, more likelihood of participating. Okay, so there's something going on with the humanities and social sciences. Maybe it's that students who are interested in those things already and are interested in participating are gravitating to those fields, or maybe it's something in the education itself. Okay, that's a bit hard to tease out. But there is a relation here between participating in humanities and social science subjects and being prepared to be a participant in one's community and country. So here's a little anecdotal piece that might help us just think a little bit about what might be happening in the humanities that has this kind of effect or engages students in this way. There is a book called Citizenship Across the Curriculum, which is a terrifically interesting book and a good one I would recommend if you guys haven't seen it yet, where Rebecca Nowacek is an English professor who had her students working on a problem with local public schools. And so I just want to read this excerpt as she tries to think through what her students have gotten out of this process. Early in the collaborative process of working with two classmates on the knotty local problem of school choice within Milwaukee Public Schools, an English major told me she felt that the value of her disciplinary knowledge was questioned, even slighted. One of her group mates was a political science major, well-versed in questions of public policy. The other was a speech pathologist with experience working in local schools. What could someone who sits reading novels bring to their collaborative inquiry? Whether their skepticism was real or only imagined, the English major felt the need to articulate for her groupmates and for herself what her studies of literature had prepared her to contribute to the understanding of this knotty local problem. Ultimately, she determined that what she could contribute to her group was her capacity to identify and tease out the significance of patterns in discourse. She conducted a careful reading of local newspaper coverage of school choice, identifying a number of disturbing trends. Okay, this doesn't tell us a lot. It's vague, but it gives us some initial ideas. The student's capacity to read well provided her a tool that equipped her to diagnose the spread of opinion in her community and the issues of concern. So her linguistic ability is functioning there to give her the power of diagnosis. And she recognized this as distinctive of herself in contrast to her colleagues. She's also distinguished in this passage by feeling the need to articulate what she has to contribute. And I take it that her work in the humanities is supporting that need to articulate what she sees about the world. So this combination of capacity to diagnose the language around us, which is, of course, the stuff of politics. There is not much to analyze in politics other, ultimately, than language. Yes, we need data. Yes, we need polling and evidence and so forth. But at the end of the day, when we want to understand the problems that we're wrestling with, what we're really confronted with is the case, the articulations that individuals make about what matters to them and what they think about how to get to what matters to them. And the skills of being able to interpret all of that around us, all the language and talk and argument around us, are skills that are honed only in the humanities and humanistic social sciences. So we shouldn't forget, as basic as it is, how very important it is to equip people with skills to process language in the deepest and most careful way. So, as I said, that's just an initial idea pointing us toward a place to look if we want to understand why it is or how it is that humanities majors actually help prepare people to be ready to participate in the world around them. But let's summarize again what we need out of a curriculum that could prepare people for civic agency as rich as what I've been describing. We would need a curriculum to support the fundamental intellectual work of diagnosis, as with that English major, of prescription and justification, a curriculum that helps us meet ethical challenges, learn how to regulate self-interest. We have to learn how to regulate how we think of other people's interests. We have to regulate our means and thinking. And we need success at deliberation, prophecy, and fighting fair. So what kind of curriculum actually supports that? Here's where the surprise is. It's the one we've had all along, all right? So if you want to learn how to diagnose the world around you, you have to understand the world around you, which means you need history and anthropology and cultural studies and psychology and political science. And if you want to be able to think about how to regulate your own interests or think about the interests of others, you need philosophy and you need literature which shows you how people's interests work in conflict with one another. And you need religion and the study of religious traditions to understand the sources of value that give people frameworks for thinking about how to regulate their interests and to think about other people's interests. And if you want to be able to engage in deliberation and prophecy and fighting fair, then you need all the skills of eloquence that come again from literature and from art history and the world of visual representation and symbol making, and music too, which has always been an important part of building communities and helping people express what they care about. So in other words, to do the intellectual work, to meet the ethical challenges, and to equip oneself to complete the tasks in the world of civic agency requires, above all the disciplines of the liberal arts. And as I came to this realization, this recognition of the fundamental relationship between those disciplines and the work of civic agency, I also realized that this really, at the end of the day, shouldn't surprise us. Because if we take our time to find examples of people who've been able to do this work of diagnosis, prescription, and justification, deliberation, prophecy, and fighting fair, and we go look at how they were educated, we'll find that they were educated in precisely this way. And one of my favorite examples is the Library of Thomas Jefferson, which has been installed in this way at the Library of Congress. And I invite you all to go read it, or to go walk through the shelves. But you'll find that it is precisely an array of the core subjects of the liberal arts. So history and cultural studies. Jefferson was interested in the geographies and cultures of the entire world. He had a remarkable array of books in anthropology. It's really quite stunning. We don't usually think of that as being part of what he read. And he had philosophy, and he had works on aesthetics, and aesthetics in the musical realm as well as in the realm of literature and so forth. He also had a massive array of pamphlets on slavery, and that's an issue in which, interestingly, his positions changed considerably over time, not for the good, without any question. I don't want to take away any or reduce criticism of Jefferson, but the point is he was gathering material in order to understand his world and thinking his way through it. So this library, the Library of Congress, is actually a beautiful example of the kind of education a person needs in order to be prepared to be a civic agent. And so I think then it's also no surprise that we get our pithiest expression of both this vision of civic agency and the preparation we need for it in the Declaration of Independence, okay? So I want to take us there in conclusion, just to show you that actually we've had in front of our faces all along a definition of what it means to be an engaged person, engage one's community and in one's country. And we've had in front of us all along a definition of the intellectual preparation we need and the psychological preparation we need for that work. So let's remind ourselves, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to establish new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Let's just dwell on the last cause for a moment. What's the job of the engaged citizen? Judgment. as to them, the people, shall seem most likely, it's a probabilistic judgment, to affect their safety and happiness. And it's not just my happiness for which I'm responsible, it's their happiness, which is to say our happiness, which means my job of judgment fundamentally concerns the need to make the move from my individual pursuit of happiness, my individual rights, through a collective conversation that permits us collectively to judge together our shared safety and happiness. So there we get the requirement that we are able to engage in connecting our own interests to the interests of others, right there, okay? And of course, as we look at this, we also then realize that in order to figure out whether government has become destructive of the ends of securing my rights and our collective safety and happiness, I have to be able to diagnose my circumstances. I have to be able to say where the course of human events is tending. And again, how can I do that if I haven't read history and thought about political science and engaged with psychology and sociology and so forth? So that intellectual requirement is right there. And once I've diagnosed my circumstances, I've got to prescribe, I've got to alter or abolish. Alter is a prescription. I've got to alter things. I need a prescription for altering things. So there's prescription. And the thing I need for that prescription is a combination of principle and organizational form. Right? I've got to lay the foundation of my new government or my alterations. I lay the foundation on principles, and I organize the powers of government in such form as to us shall seem most likely to affect our safety and happiness. So I have to be able to think through questions of value and meaning, human value. What are the principles that should define our communities? But I also have to be able to understand the way in which institutional structure, how we organize the powers of government, gets us closer or farther to setting up the conditions of possibility for our individual effort to live flourishing lives, okay? And again, how can I understand how we organize the powers of government if I don't ever study political science or think about the institutions of my government? How can I? I can't. So the short of it is, the Declaration of Independence is already telling us that we need a liberal arts education to do our fundamental job as democratic citizens. Thank you. So I think we have time for questions. And as I said, that's my favorite part. So don't let me down. And I understand we've got mics up here. And so yes, if you don't mind coming up to the mic, which I know the acoustics in here are terrific, but yes, this way I think everything's being recorded, and then your question will be recorded. So.
I have a question and a statement. First of all, a statement. I nominate Pope Francis to be the ideal civic person. If you take a look at how he's functioning, he meets your criteria to a T.
Super interesting.
I happen to be a math major who has voted in every single election.
Excellent. There's always outliers.
Since 1960, when you have to be
Excellent.
21, so you can figure out how old I am. But it seems to me that what is really important is if you can have a mixture, because my major was math, but my minors were political science and music. And so unless you get channeled into something, I think almost any college education will sharpen your analytical and critical skills.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I agree. And I would never suggest that my argument was meant to say that we should forget about math by any stretch of the imagination. I agree that we need both, and they need to be working together. So the thrust of my argument is that we have really lost sight of the value that the humanities and social sciences end of the liberal arts contributes to the preparation of young people for flourishing adult lives. And absolutely, I mean, and in that regard, given how full our policy landscape and public discourse is of statistics and statistical reasoning, People have a quite profound need for fluency in mathematical concepts in order to be good judges of the courses, the various prescriptions presented to us. So couldn't agree more. Thank you. Here we go. Thanks. Yep, exactly.
So I wanted to ask a question about the fact that you want to defend an integrated conception of civic agency. So there's a lot of things going on here. The critically engaged individual, an activist, a politician, they have different tasks, deliberation, prophecy, and fair fighting. They have different challenges and different, in a sense, profiles. Sometimes they're working on the basis of self-interest. Sometimes they're fighting against it. And it seemed you want to say that we want to integrate all of these such that, depending on the circumstances, the individual should take on different roles and fulfill different tasks. And so the question I have is, on the basis of what ought a person to decide what tasks or what roles they should take on, and therefore what tasks they should be engaged in? Because in a sense, it seems that's going to be perhaps the most fundamental normative crux. And I guess the underlying worry is that, based on what you said here at the end, it sounds as though commitment to the public good, public safety and happiness, is going to be the most important thing to determine which role you take on, which tasks you engage in. But if that's the case, what's the place of self-interest? It seems as though you're selecting for certain tasks, certain roles, as against others, and it's not really integrated.
Right. Thank you. That's a terrific question. So, to some extent, there's not a sort of a priori answer to that question, precisely because a person has to make judgments about circumstances. But so what would be the sort of general guidelines or principles for making those judgments? And I think, in the first instance, it is actually precisely a question of interest. That is, if the issue on the public's agenda is one about which you have passionate feelings, then you should fess up to those passionate feelings and take on the role of an advocate or an activist, but in the context of sort of the ethical parameters of doing that, being equitable in one's pursuit of one's own interests. And it's the idea of being equitable in the pursuit of one's own interest that, conceptually at least, is supposed to harmonize individual interest with the public good, right? And then for all those people who are not so passionate about that issue, then that's the moment for them to take on the deliberator role, right? And then they become part of how the competing interests get adjudicated, right? So they're having to do the hard work of trying to figure out how do we balance all these competing interests and so forth. And so one should, I think, really be able to move through these different positions and different roles according to what the kind of burning issues are on the public plate. Yeah, thanks.
Let me start by saying I don't have an answer to my question, so I guess that's why I'm asking it.
I probably won't have an answer either then. So then we could ask everybody else. How's that sound?
One of the things that has been one of this generation's challenges relative to the prior generation in the middle of, sort of the middle third of the 20th century in the US, is a sense that we have a more difficult time dealing with some of your themes of dealing with polarization and conflict for a variety of different potential reasons. But from a longer view, if we were to go back prior to the middle of the 20th century, things were also very polarized, and the US political system had a very difficult time dealing with conflict. And whether you want to ground it in the sort of historical arc of that narrative from polarization to moderation and back out to polarization again, or you want to just reflect on whatever aspect of the challenge of today's polarization that you have the most to share with us.
Right.
What are your thoughts for why things seem to have polarized more over the last 30 years, and what would be some suggested strategies for reducing the level of polarization? Thank you.
Well, that's a hugely important question, and like you, I don't have answers. So I will do my best to share some thoughts, as you suggested. Thank you. So, a few things. I would want to put on the table, I suppose, three things. The issue of gerrymandering and redistricting, the issue of the dramatic decline of engagement in local politics, and the third thing, sorry, I just managed to fly out of my head. I'll have to come back to it. I'll just stick with those two for the moment, sorry. So, I mean, everybody, we talk a lot about the issue of gerrymandering and redistricting and the ways in which we've just reduced the number of districts that are genuinely competitive. And if you have more competitive districts, then notionally it pulls people toward the middle because they have to compete for people who are in the middle. Empirically, it's a little bit of a question whether that would actually prove to be the case if we were able to take districts back in this more competitive direction. But my own view is it's definitely worth trying. And so then the second thing is one of the problems with our not engaging at the local level is that it's easier to think about the issues at the local level in ways that don't track national parties. And so then you get more sort of overlapping kinds of connection and allegiance that help moderate things at the national level. And so I think it's really important for us to sort of shift the balance back away from the sort of national level to municipal, county level, state level politics, and really work on re-engaging people there. And I'm terribly embarrassed that the third one fled out of my mind and it hasn't come back yet, so hopefully it will, and maybe I'll be able to tell you. But thank you for your question.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I find myself wondering, so you get a liberal arts education?
I know what it was.
Go ahead.
Sorry, okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I apologize. Compromise. Just the concept of compromise, which is basically a dirty word. And we have got to recover a positive understanding of its value, because you just cannot have a democracy without compromise, by definition. So if you go back to this clause again, the idea that the people is choosing a course is only possible if the people achieves compromises that it recognizes are not the end of the conversation. You go on then to the next iteration of the conversation. And that is another way of spelling out the idea I was trying to express of winner-take-nothing politics. Compromises when, no, you don't win all the way down, and the odds are, there's going to be a sort of pushing back at another version of the fight 10 years down the line. It's very hard to hold up the value of compromise when the first original sin compromise was around slavery, right? And so this is a kind of theoretical and ethical problem that I think it would be very good to have everybody working on. I don't really know how to address it, but when that's your kind of leading example of compromise, it's very hard to recover that as something that we should all be trying to do. But I think it is something we need to recover, something we should all be trying to do. And so figuring out how to kind of clean up the concept, show the difference between good compromises and bad compromises seems to me really important.
So you made a very compelling case for a liberal arts education. So my question is, then what? So do you have a roadmap for lifelong learning for the engaged citizen?
Well, I do believe in lifelong learning for the engaged citizen, so I've been a big advocate of state humanities councils and have in various ways worked hard to help state humanities councils be able to take a bigger role in supporting lifelong learning. And I do think universities everywhere can support lifelong learning. And actually, this is another one of these kind of complicated subjects, but if you look at the history of higher ed over the last 50 years, one of the distinctive features of it is that 50 years ago, when kids went away to the distinctively liberal arts colleges, right, which is a small subset of them, they tended to go home again afterwards. And I think of that as something, then they're contributing to the culture of their own community, bringing what they learned in that liberal arts environment to wherever it was they came from originally. That doesn't happen anymore. Kids don't go home anymore. And so we've really lost our capacity as a society with our network of institutions to take the kind of learning and ways of thinking that come out of a liberal arts environment and have those be just really sprinkled throughout the entirety of the polity, the entirety of the citizenry. And so figuring out what to do about that, I think, is a really critical question.
I really appreciated your emphasis on activist as being an important part, but it's been my impression through my life that activism is not valued and it's looked down on. And I wondered if you agreed with that, and if you do, what you think we could do about it so that we can get more activists to question the values and maybe do some of that framing shifting.
Thank you very much. So when I got going working on this project, part of the reason I did was precisely because I kept finding myself in spaces where people were were arguing and saying, civic engagement is this model of disinterested, dispassionate deliberation on the one, and that's it, like that's all that belongs in the category of civic engagement. And then other people would say, no, civic engagement is about being committed to a cause and working really hard on that specific cause and so forth and pursuing it all the way. And I just I was like, actually, surely both of these things are part of what it means to be an engaged person. So yes, in a certain sense, I do think that the figure of the activist has been devalued in our general picture of what civic engagement is about. And so I am, in that regard, trying to bring it inside the framework. But at the same time that I'm trying to bring it inside the framework, I'm also trying to hold up the figure of the activist to sort of a higher set of ethical standards and have perhaps always been applied to that category. So we have much deeper and more elaborate sort of philosophical traditions for thinking about the role of the disinterested deliberator and that sort of civically engaged person. We don't have the same depth of tradition for thinking about the role of the activist. And so I'm sort of trying to start thinking in that direction in order to put those two pieces together. But it also matters for me that people be able to see it's not an either-or choice, and that there's a time and place for different ones of these roles. And so in a similar way, I also think that I often heard from people who take the activist side of the picture a real sort of disdain for the people who try to sort of propose a disinterested model of participation. And so in that regard, I'm also trying to recuperate the idea of disinterestedness from some of the critique it's come under lately. So.
Thank you very much for your offering here. Sometimes it's easier to understand what we're talking about if we understand who are your prophets.
Right. Who are my prophets?
Well, yes, who are your prophets?
Wow. Okay. That's a great question. So, as an intellectual, I have three. And they are Hannah Arendt, whom you heard about, George Orwell, and Ralph Ellison. Okay? So very different kinds of writers and thinkers. But those would be what Ellison he talked about various writers as his ancestors, and I would say that those three are my ancestors. As a human being, it's my parents. So my parents have always been people who've been dedicated to public service and to very powerful conceptions of citizenship and civic duty. And in that regard, I'm just still a kid doing what her parents taught her to do. So thanks for your question. Yeah.
First off, again, thank you. But I have a question as a current college student. I know you touched on social media and the influence it has, but I just was wondering what impact you think it could have or does have on being a participating citizen.
So the answer to that question is just huge, so huge. And it's really important. Social media has given us tremendous opportunities and equally tremendous challenges. And we saw the opportunities faster than we have come to understand the challenges. So the opportunities are obvious. It's easier to participate in the sense of sharing one's opinion, engaging in communities of conversation around issues. It's easier to do things like sign petitions and get involved in things. In survey data from some friends of mine, it's also clear that young people who will start off participating on Facebook or something else, around a cultural thing they care about, like again, maybe it's Harry Potter or something else, will evolve from what people call that participatory culture experience to a participatory sort of politics experience. And if you look at Black Lives Matter, for example, that is straightforwardly an example of a group of young people who learn to be engaged in cultural ways in social media and have taken the techniques of that engagement and turned it into a political project. Okay, so the opportunities that social media presents are evident, and people saw those right from the get-go. So what are the challenges? It's a long list, and I think we were talking about this at lunch. I think it is sort of a responsibility of institutions like this to try to figure out how do you solve some of these problems. Like when you have had a huge disruption, it's not surprising that we would all wander around in like confusion for some time. And we will eventually, I'm confident, get our hands around the situation, but there's a lot of work to do. So for one thing, and we talked about this a little bit in the class I visited this morning, social media has supported the fragmentation of our electorate, okay, because the good comes with the bad, so it's easier to organize and cooperate, which means it's easier for smaller groups of people to form solidarity groups, basically, and function like quasi-political parties. And the example I gave is the case of Donald Trump, a significant portion of whose supporters, like 60% of his supporters in the last poll, are people who still think that Obama's birth certificate is false. This group of people, birthers, has been a steady number ever since, even after Obama released his long-form birth certificate. That number has stayed at about 20% of the registered Republicans. Okay, so that is a stable group of people. It is not going to melt away. Trump is going to carry that number to the end of this nominating process. That kind of group, with that sort of solidaristic connection and interaction, is very social media supported and so forth, which wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago. It's causing a huge problem in the context of a two-party system, right? Because it's not exactly visible as a standalone group, but it really is a standalone group. It's not the same as where the Republican Party has been 25 years ago and so forth. So there's a kind of fragmentation of the electorate. You can, on the other side, what I sometimes say to people, if we had a parliamentary system, it would be obvious the way in which social media has broken the electorate into more passionate, sort of single interest focused groups. Like, the birthers on the one hand, you could point on the other side of the political spectrum to netizens, so people who live in the world of technology and are very committed to things like completely open access to information and that kind of thing. And in Europe, you have examples of both of these kinds of groups in parliaments, right? And so it's very hard for us to understand and make sense of the fragmentation of the electorate given our two-party system, but that fragmentation has been driven by and made possible by social media. So that's the challenge we have to figure out how to get our heads around. And then there's the issue of, again, talking about this at lunch, the vastly increased power that celebrity has now, okay? So think about a democratic system. You've got power from numbers, just people. We are a source of power, and the more of us that are on one side of something, that's the sort of source of power. You've got power that comes from money. You've got power that comes from institutions and the actual, capacity of the state to deploy force and so forth. That's just sort of straightforward part of the structure of institutions. And now, to an unprecedented degree, you have power that comes from celebrity, because celebrity automatically gets eyeballs, which is numbers. And we haven't, in terms of our sort of theoretical thinking about the architecture, institutional architecture of our democracy, we haven't ever really asked the question of how do you check and balance the power of celebrity, okay? But maybe we need to ask that question, because it's not really clear that celebrity should be one of the biggest bases of power affecting the direction of our politics. So that's a huge question to get our heads around. And then there's just the sort of third area of basic decency. How is it that we reestablish codes for interaction, including in online environments, that are not about mutually destroying one another? And here, this is a kind of trivial example compared to the magnitude of the difficulty, but I'll give it anyway. It sort of reminds me of the issue of trains. I don't know if you guys have experienced this, but if you take Amtrak along the Northeast or any of the kind of commuter rails in various parts of the country, Now you'll find that they all have a designated quiet car, right? And why do they have a designated quiet car? Because people got really tired of all the rudeness and incivility. But we couldn't figure out how to ourselves solve the problem. Like, it was a collective action problem. Like, everybody was annoyed, but nobody had the guts to stand up in the train and say, would you please speak more quietly, or would you please turn off your loud music? Like, none of us had the guts to do that. So the train companies solved the problem for us by introducing a rule that there'd be quiet cars. So the problem in the space of social media is we have to solve the same kind of problem, but we have to solve it. Like, we have to solve this collective action problem, and we don't want somebody else to solve it for us. I mean, if anybody could. I don't think anybody could, but we also don't really want them to. So how do we solve that collective action problem to reestablish social norms of decency? So, yeah. Okay, looks like last question here. Sound good? Okay.
So thank you again for sharing your ideas with us. I'm currently a business student, and I was just curious, what roles do businesses have in this civic engagement and social change?
That's an interesting question. That's a super interesting question. I mean, businesses have always had responsibilities to their local communities, right? And that's an important thing for businesses to think about. And one of the challenges now is just the increasing number of multinational firms that don't have a strong sense of the local community to which they're responsible. So that's a question. And then there are just the sort of very hard issues of, take climate change as an example. I think for people for whom climate change is the number one issue, the general view is that corporations have a serious degree of responsibility in that space, and sort of figuring out, well, what's the right way to think about values inside a corporation that make it possible for a corporation to think about its social responsibility at the same time that it's also thinking about, pursuing profits and so forth. There ought to be a way inside a firm to meld those values. And I think there's a lot of literature by economists who sort of track the changes in cultures in the business world over the course of the 20th century, from points in time where firms were really held together by a strong sense of values, in addition to making profit, right? Sort of values about integrity and values about responsibility to sort of local community and things like that. And so I think there's room for rebuilding those kinds of ethical cultures inside of firms, basically. Business school ethics programs in various ways, I think, do sometimes engage with these questions. Harvard's business school is currently at work revising its ethics curriculum precisely in order to sort of think through this question of the structure of values inside firms and how it relates to people who are in business, figuring out how to set their self-interest in relationship to a broader sense of public interest. So, thanks for your question. Thank you so much for your attention. Sorry?
Something to give you.
Okay.
Wow.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Well, Professor Allen, thank you so much for inspiring us, for making us think. You've all got some good fodder for next week, right, around the Thanksgiving tables. Some great topics for discussion. We do have some tokens of our appreciation here from the university that we hope will help you to remember your visit here to James Madison University, and we would love to have you back again. These are conversations that we take very seriously here, and we really are trying to think hard about what we can do as a university and a community to make a difference on these very issues. So thank you so much for giving us so much food for thought.